From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Ahead today, an extended look at the current state of the Kansas wheat crop, and centering on a couple of lead topics there, with K-State's Romulo Lollato joining us, the extent to which the crop might have incurred freeze damage from that run of unseasonably cold temperatures in late October, and the factors that must be considered before replanting or overseeding a thin stand, including the percent of expected stand that remains, the replanting date, and seeding rate adjustments. Romulo will cover all of that with us next. Later on, with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas, K-State's Gus Vanderhoeven will join us. And there's much more coming up on this Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
You're tuned in to the Wednesday edition of Agriculture Today. Glad to have you along with us. Well, we'll talk winter wheat production in Kansas during the first part of today's broadcast, and we brought back in, after quite a while since our last visit, Romulo Lollato, wheat production specialist, K-State Research and Extension, on a couple of angles concerning this winter wheat stand out in Kansas, the recent quite cold temperatures in the state, and if one is inclined to replant their wheat, what they need to think about. But Romulo, just your latest observations, the numbers this week out of the USDA said that winter wheat in Kansas was 28% good to excellent, 49% fair, 23% was regarded as poor to very poor. Does that jive with what you're seeing out in the country right now?
Yeah, Eric, I think that makes sense. So essentially, sometime there in mid-September, we had a considerable amount of precipitation kind of throughout the state. But before that, it was actually quite dry, right? So much that the summer crops were actually maturing earlier this year. And we had some precipitation in that mid-September time frame. Now, with that, some growers were able to go ahead and take the most out of that moisture. So planting sometime in that last 2 weeks of September. And that early planted crop was actually coming up nice and looking really good. Actually looking really, really decent, very good stands and a good early development there. Now, essentially, we haven't really had any significant precipitation from that mid-September all the way to late October. So about a month and a half there without any significant precipitation in most of the state. And even in that late October, it was only the southern half of the state that got any significant amount of moisture as rainfall. Right. So with that, growers who are actually planting in that early to mid-October time frame, and after that, we're not really seeing much emergence out of those fields, right? Either they were able to reach moisture in that top 1.5 inches or 2 inches. Some guys were going as far as 2 inches and trying to reach that moisture, or the moisture was further down enough that the growers are actually dusting the crop in without any substantial moisture, and so without any emergence. So really what we're seeing there is two very different crops. The early planted one, they got a good emergence, and that's a good part of the wheat planted in western Kansas. And then the majority of the crop that got planted on time, really in that early October, even to mid-October time frame, it was actually very variable depending on the field. Some fields got a good emergence, other fields did not. And so we were slightly behind on emergence this year as compared to, even though we were ahead in planting, as far as planting progress goals. The crop was slightly behind in emergence there, and talking to many growers around the state, that's still the general feeling. For many of those growers, the crop haven't emerged even until now, if they didn't get that precipitation in late October. So that's more or less the state of the wheat crop now. Many of the fields that emerged on time, or they were planted early September, were able to emerge and have a fall canopy being developed there. But there are many fields out there that were dusted in they weren't lucky enough to get this precipitation in late October, and they're still waiting on that moisture to come up. So very variable, Eric, as I've noticed the last 5 years in Kansas that can be. So.
Right. This is nothing new for wheat production in Kansas, but it's not off to a roaring start, this new crop, by any stretch. And you have been, Romulo, cranking out information via the Agronomy E-Update newsletter on winter wheat and some things to consider and perhaps observe. And one of those recently was our dip into extremely low temperatures for late October here just several days back, and whether or not there's cold injury to the wheat crop.
Yeah, so if we look back, it was the October 26th and October 27th when we had some very, very low cold temperatures. In fact, if we look at the lowest temperature recorded around the state in that October 27th, the 20 hour prior to that October 27th, we were reaching as far as 0 degrees Fahrenheit in the northwest corner of the state, all the way to about 29 or 30 in the southeast corner of the state. But if we think of just the wheat growing area, central and western Kansas, the lowest temperature ranged from 0 to about mid-20s there, 23, 24 Fahrenheit or so. So parts of the state, it did get really cold. Some of this was accompanied by snowfall, right? So we were also having anywhere from 0 all the way to about 5 inches, close to 5 inches of snowfall, more concentrated in the northwest corner. So the concern there, Eric, comes about because during this time of the year, wheat is building winter hardiness, but it's not as winter hardy as it's going to get towards December, right? So as soon as the crop is planted and it emerges, it can handle probably 15 degrees Fahrenheit fairly well. But a crop that has recently emerged, if we're dipping below those 15 Fahrenheit, we can start seeing some damage, right? We can start losing some stands, especially in the lower areas of the field where it might have been even colder, right? And then as the crop progresses towards the fall, it's accumulating some of those cold acclimation substances in the plant, and so it's more winter hardy towards the fall. So the concern there was with crops that had just emerged, right? Because those crops was really not very winter hardy. Again, just being able to handle about 15 Fahrenheit or so. Now, if we look at the region that got less than 15 Fahrenheit, which was the north central Kansas through northwest Kansas, really, so kind of that majority of the northwest part of the state, it did reach temperatures that could be damage to the crop. However, it was also accompanied by snow. And anytime that we have more than 1.5 or 2 inches of snow cover, it can actually protect the crop from those cold temperatures. And so underneath that snow, that 2 or 3 inches layer of snow, it's probably going to be pretty close to that 32 Fahrenheit or so. So it's actually acting as an insulating layer there, just like maintaining those soil temperatures a little bit warmer. If we go more like west central Kansas and towards southwest part of the state, the temperatures were more or less in that threshold from 11 to 15 Fahrenheit or so. That was the minimum. So in fields that got below that 15 Fahrenheit, with no snowfall in that region of the state, might be exposed to some sort of damage from those cold temperatures. And what makes that worse, it can be soil moisture status as well, because a soil that is drier, it's going to change temperatures faster than a soil that has moisture to it. And so that combination, at that point in time, when it was still dry, afterwards part of the state got some precipitation, but at that point in time, the combination of dryness and in regions of the state that got below 15 Fahrenheit with very limited to no snow cover, that's where we could see some level of damage, Eric.
There's a variety of conditions that may exist out there. And as far as being able to tell if there is freeze injury, though, Romulo, now that we've had a few warmer days, those telltale signs should be more evident, shouldn't they?
Yeah, we've been now after about a week or so, right? We might see some browning of the leaves, which by itself might not indicate that the damage was substantial to the crop yet. But if we start seeing some green leaf tissue coming out, and because of these warmer temperatures, we start seeing some artillery out of the crop, that's probably a good indication that the crop is fine and didn't sustain significant damage. Now, If we see that the crop is not really bouncing back, even though it might have moisture again, wherever that precipitation in late October brought some sort of moisture to the crop. If we don't see that crop producing new leaves and new tealers, then that's a pretty bad indication that we might have sustained some loss there from those cold temperatures.
The primary worry here is with that crown of the plant, isn't it? And whether or not it's incurred damage.
Yeah, so at this point in time, right, that's why we're coming back to that issue whether the crop was emerged or not, and as dry as it was during October, right? Because when is that crown formed? First thing that comes out of that seed once it's planted is the little radicule, and then is the coleoptile. Once the coleoptile breaks through the soil surface and is exposed to sunlight, that's when the crown is going to be formed. So if the soil temperatures at more or less that 1 inch depth, more or less, are reaching damaging levels, that's where we can actually see loss of entire stands, kind of like what we saw in November 2014, right? Parts of northwest Kansas got hit really hard by that drop in temperature in November 2014, and many stands were actually lost due to winter kill. But the point that you were bringing up is important, Eric, because if it's just a leaf damage, the plant is very likely going to recover from it, especially if it has enough moisture in that topsoil. Now, if those soil temperatures actually reach damaging levels to damage the crown of the plant, that's where we're concerned. Now, the Kansas Maisonette is a very good resource to check those soil temperatures. We have stations throughout the state, and it's measuring soil temperature at 2 and 4 inches depth. That 2 inches soil temperature is a pretty good indication of how cold it got in the crown.
Well, producers do need to, clearly, get out into their fields if they have worries about possible freeze injury to their stands and take a look, see what's going on. Use the maisonette.ksu.edu website for that soil temperature and soil moisture information. But then it's to the decision, Romulo, on the part of some anyway, perhaps, whether or not to replant that winter wheat stand. And that's what we want to tackle with you next after the break, if you'd stand by. Romulo Lollato with us, wheat production specialist, K-State Research and Extension, and you're tuned to Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
We're back now on this Agriculture Today as we're discussing the state of the winter wheat crop in Kansas, and now this question that may be before some producers out there, whether or not they should replant a stand that isn't looking terribly vigorous. Romulo Lollato is with us once more, wheat production specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Now, Romulo, the decision to replant needs to be contemplated very carefully before pulling the trigger on that, right?
Yeah, so the decision to replant is going to be field by field, right? It's field specific depending on the condition and for that specific field for different reasons, right? So if we take a snapshot of the Kansas crop this year, we see that number one cause for producers considering to replant the crop was lack of emergence, right? Because of those dry conditions that we had for the majority of the month of October. Now, it's very important to consider this because if dry soils are the reason why we didn't have an emergence, replanting might not do anything to the crop, right? If you dig throughout the field and the seeds are still there, good, viable, dry, and that did not begin to germinate, replanting it is not going to do anything to that field, right? We're not going to have any emergence there, again, because there's no moisture, and that's the cause of the lack of emergence there. Now, there are many fields that emergence was very scattered and kind of sporadic throughout the field as well. And again, many of the times because of patches in the field that were more moist than others, or perhaps because of a inconsistencies in the drill depth, and then sometimes reaching a little bit deeper and into moisture compared to other parts of the field that might not have reached moisture. And so in those cases, it might be worth to at least go ahead and double check what is happening with those seeds, right? Has the seed started to germinate and perished later because it was too dry and then it never made into a crop? Well, maybe then we can consider replanting in those parts of the field or those fields that are into that condition. But if the seed is still there, good and viable, and it's just going to wait for some moisture. So again, it is a field-to-field decision. And for a grower to take that decision, he needs to consider a few different things here. One of them, how uniform is the stand? Another one, how many plants does he have there as compared to his target? The date, right? How late is too late to replant the crop? And then, of course, some other considerations there as an insurance cutoff date and weed control as well. But Eric, those would be the main things that a grower needs to consider when taking the decision on replant.
Let's take up those factors individually briefly, if we might then, Romulo. That stand uniformity, and that is a signal perhaps of whether or not to replant. What is a producer looking for in as far as that uniformity here?
So as we were just discussing before here, Eric, sometimes the entire field might not have been emerged yet, and that's probably because of how dry the soils are. And again, if digging that seed and the seed is still viable and good, well, probably then the best is just to leave it alone and wait. Now, when I talk about the uniformity, as well as that many fields are going to have patches with good emergence and patches with bad emergence, again, mostly due to position on the landscape, perhaps a bottom part of the field where water accumulates more might have emerged and be looking pretty good, whereas the top part of the field where water drains more out of there might be much drier and then might not have had a good emergence, right? So the recommendation there is to go into those patches of poor emergence and double check for the quality of the seed, for the viability of the seed. Is the seed still there and viable? If so, not much to do. If the seed started to emerge and perished, then it might be worth to replant those areas and hope for some rain in the near future to get that emergence. But again, it's tied up to our next consideration here, which is what's our percent stand compared to the goal? Where are we compared to where we want it to be?
You're looking at that in percentage terms, right?
Yes, looking at that in percentage terms, right? If you planted enough there that you were shooting for 1.2 million plants per acre, for example, how many plants did you end up with in that acre? Do you have 300,000 plants in that acre? Well, then it's probably very worth to go ahead and consider replanting that field. But if you have 700,000 or 800,000 plants out there, well, you might be fine, right? You might be fine with that stand, especially if we have some moisture in the near future, and that helps that crop filter out. Whenever we think of the percent stand as compared to the goal, the general rule of thumb is about 50%, right? So if you have about 50% of your goal, the crop can still compensate a lot. Remember that wheat is a very elastic plant, meaning that if it has space, it's going to filter out in resources, right? If it has space, water, and nutrients, it will filter out and it will fill up that space. So again, as a general rule of thumb, check what was your target population, do some counts out in the field to have a good idea of where you stand. And then if that percent is below probably about 50% or so of where you want it to be, then probably worth going out and replanting. And then we usually suggest replanting that field at a 45-degree angle. So we're not killing any entire rows, or just crossing those rows at an angle to minimize the damage to the existing stand. We put out in our e-update a table that would help growers calculate how far they are from their potential stand, depending on seed size that they planted and their row spacing as well, and their target population. So check the e-update for that table and just do a few counts in per row foot. It's actually pretty simple, and compared to the values that we have in that table, is going to give you a pretty good idea of where your stand stands.
And that table, once again, is in the e-update newsletter, which was posted on the 23rd of October, so for reference on that. Then there is this other question that looms large, Romulo, the replanting date. Here we are in November, a little late, or getting so, depending on where you are in the state. And coupling with that, the seeding rate as it would relate to that planting date. You have some numbers to share there, too.
Yes, Eric. So I completely agree with you. We're into November already, and so that means that it's probably getting pretty late to plant wheat, especially in the northwest part of the state, perhaps north central Kansas as well. Wouldn't be the first time that somebody plants wheat in November in those parts of the state, but it is getting pretty late. And the later it gets, the less time the crop has to filter out and to compensate for that late planting. So we need to increase our seeding rates, right? Again, if there is a condition that for some reason the entire field was planted and started to emerge, ran out of moisture and perished, then the recommendation there is to replant it, increasing at least a good 10% or so from the optimal seeding rate in the optimal date for every week that it is delayed. So if you're 4 weeks later, you probably want to plant 30-40% more seeds out there than you would in your optimal date. Now, if we're talking about just replanting and a stand that is about 40-50% emerged again, so we're talking about plants that are already there and emerged, but the field is pretty scattered, then we usually suggest reducing those rates because we're not planting the full stand, right? We're simply fulfilling that stand. So maybe if we're planting now in November, probably in western Kansas, I'll probably suggest putting a good 60 pounds per acre out there, or we're even suggesting 75 or so for parts of central Kansas. So again, if the stands are much less than normal, we need to try and fulfill those, increasing those seeding rates.
All right. And there are these other things that one can think about, too, and that would include weed control and the insurance cutoff date. That needs to be plugged into this equation as well as to whether to replant or not. This is an option that certainly one needs to weigh all factors before making a commitment to replant, because there's a risk involved here.
Yes, definitely. And with that risk, we need to consider which parts of the state actually received rainfall since we planted, right? And that's mostly just the south central part of the state and parts of southwest Kansas, right? Really the entire northern edge of Kansas, northern half of Kansas, haven't really received any precipitation. And so it's a tough decision that needs to take several things into account before it is made. And as you mentioned, weed control being one of them, especially because if you're replanting, the plants in that field are going to be all over as far as growth stage goes. And many herbicides, they have a pretty clear cutoff from growth stages, like they should not be applied before a given growth stage or after a given growth stage. So that really makes managing herbicides in those fields a little bit harder because you need to consider the stage of those early planted plants versus those late planted plants as well. So there's many things to consider, Eric, just not a very easy decision.
Well, all of this is, again, summarized in an article that Romulo authored on replanting decisions for winter wheat, and even at this 11th hour, whether or not that's a viable option for you producers. You can find that in the Agronomy e-update newsletter dated the 23rd of October at agronomy.ksu.edu. Romulo, we always appreciate your input, and we'll touch base again soon. Many thanks right here.
Thanks, Eric.
That from Romulo Lollato, Wheat Production Specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Agriculture Today will be back after these moments away. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson with you as we roll on now into today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. And in case you didn't notice, there was a general election yesterday, and by the last account, we are a long way from knowing whom will be president come January. We do know some congressional results of significance to agriculture in a major shakeup for agricultural policy. House Agriculture Committee Chairman Collin Peterson, a Democrat from Minnesota, has lost his congressional seat to former Minnesota Lieutenant Governor Michelle Fischbach, a Republican. With the 85% of the precincts in that district reporting, Fischbach had won 53% of the vote. Peterson had 40%. Fischbach has said she will seek a seat on the House Agriculture Committee, but she would be a freshman member of that committee. Now, Peterson's defeat means there will be a new chairman of the committee. The Democrats have maintained their majority in the House, and the Democrat with the most seniority after Peterson, well, there are a few. Representatives David Scott of Georgia, Jim Costa of California, and Marcia Fudge of Ohio. Democrats were expected overall to hold the House and gain seats, but multiple freshman Democrats did lose their re-election bids in the states of Iowa, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Virginia. Freshman House Agriculture Committee member Representative Abigail Spanberger in Virginia's 7th District was trailing GOP State Representative Nick Freitas, who had been a candidate for U.S. Senate back in 2018 before losing in the Republican primary. 99% of the precincts in there, Spanberger was trailing by 60% to 39% approximately. And another House Agriculture Committee freshman Democrat, Representative Jacques Torres Small, representing New Mexico's 2nd District, lost to Republican Yvette Harrell in a rematch from 2018. And in Iowa, Democratic Representative Abby Finkenauer, 48% of the vote. Republican challenger Ashley Hinton, 51% of the vote there. Now, in the Senate races, Democrats needed to have a net gain of at least 3 seats to gain control of the Senate. Democrats did pick up seats in Arizona and Colorado, but an incumbent Republican held on in Iowa, and an Alabama seat did turn Republican, so it appears that the Senate will remain weighted toward the GOP. Of course, here in Kansas, the race to replace retiring Senator Pat Roberts, the chairman of the Senate Agriculture Committee, Republican Roger Marshall defeating Democrat Barbara Boyer 52.7% to 42.4%, with 85% of the vote counted as of that time. In Iowa, Senator Joni Ernst was leading Democrat Teresa Greenfield 51 to 45%, 99% of that vote counted. Also of note to agricultural interests in Mississippi, Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith, a Republican and a member of the Senate Agriculture Committee, has won her first full term in the Senate. Hyde-Smith was appointed back in 2018 before winning a special election to serve the remaining 2 years of that term. Hyde-Smith defeated Democrat challenger Mike Espy, a former USDA secretary who also ran for that seat in 2018. Environmental groups are now challenging the Trump administration's approval of atrazine, now asking the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit in San Francisco to set aside the restrictions from the EPA's September decision. This petition was filed by the Rural Coalition, Pesticide Action Network North America, Beyond Pesticides, the Center for Biological Diversity, and the Center for Food Safety. They're alleging that the EPA violated its duties in the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act in approving the interim registrations. Atrazine is under re-registration review by the EPA. In September, the agency released an interim registration decision approving its continued use. Environmental groups have lobbied for atrazine to be banned entirely for some time, based on concerns about human health risks and environmental problems. In September, the agency announced a number of new requirements in its interim registration for atrazine, now requiring a reduction of the maximum application rate for atrazine when used on residential turf, and it's finalizing label requirements to include mandatory spray drift control measures to minimize pesticide drift into non-target areas, including bodies of water, as well as updating label directions to slow weed resistance to atrazine. Also to note, the new label language would prohibit spraying during a temperature inversion, also would set a 15-mile-per-hour wind speed restriction for aerial and ground applications, and would add specific boom and nozzle requirements. The EPA has also proposed ending one of two ongoing atrazine water monitoring programs started back in 2004. As part of that routine re-registration review of atrazine, the EPA has been releasing draft ecological and human health risk assessments for public comment. The EPA will next complete the draft biological evaluations for atrazine. The evaluations expected to be available for public comment this fall. Well, just in time for the holiday season, the slogan, "Beef, It's What's for Dinner," will return to television. Scarlett Higgins tells us here this is the first time since 2003 the Beef Checkoff-funded advertisements have been televised.
Beef It's What's for Dinner will air a limited number of ads during the Hallmark Channel's Countdown to Christmas holiday programming event. New 15-second drool log ads will appear throughout late November and December. The ads are based on the 2-hour-long video of a prime rib roast slowly cooking over an open flame that was successfully released last year during the holidays, garnering more than 14 million views. According to National Cattlemen's Beef Association Federation Division Chairman Buck Werbine, a cattle feeder from Nebraska, while broadcast television is usually out of reach, the opportunity to advertise during the Hallmark Channel's movie marathon boiled down to the right network, the right ad, the right time, and the right price tag. In addition to bringing the iconic brand back to broadcast television, Beef It's What's for Dinner will help consumers navigate how to make the perfect holiday meal throughout digital and social media efforts. Consumers will be able to access new versions of the drool log videos on social media. The landing page on beefitswhatsfordinner.com will be shoppable, meaning visitors can click on any beef recipe and be taken to an online shopping cart for their local grocery store. Beef It's What's for Dinner also will be working with two partners to run e-commerce campaigns during the month of December, aiming to increase beef sales. And the brand will leverage food and nutrition influencers and celebrity chefs to create their own beef recipes for the holiday season. I'm Scarlett Higgins.
And those among the headlines from today's agricultural news page. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and in a few moments we'll hear once again from K-State's Gus Vanderhoeven. This is the K-State Radio Network.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
In the process of reclaiming the land, some small farms were added together to make larger farms.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
Last week, I talked about a landscape restoration project in the Netherlands. It was an old historic landscape which had been developed in a productive, small-scale agricultural landscape. But now it is being restored to its older and more natural form with emphasis on recreation. That emphasis should not come as a surprise for a country only 1/6 the size of Kansas and with 17 million people. In the process of reclaiming the land, some small farms were added together to make larger farms. Others changed their emphasis to more intensive farming or expanded their option. A dairy farm switched to producing special yogurt. Other dairy farms started making their own cheese. When the farms were no longer large enough to run cows, they switched to goats and made goat cheese as their specialty. Other farms switched to intensive horticulture, either fruit or vegetables, flowers, or mushrooms. Of course, remember the markets are all very close, and people can quickly walk, drive, or bike to their favorite supplier of the special and country fresh products. Cities and communities are all very close together. And as I try to explain, holding it all together is the small landscape around the stream, the Beerse, running through it as an artery. It is a pleasant valley. What I just described is nothing new. We also have the farmer markets and the close-by farms inviting us to choose our own pumpkins or get lost in the corn maze. Here in Manhattan, when I drive to the farm, I pass a goat farm where cheese is being made. As I go on, I cross the Tuttle Lake Dam, surely a point of interest. And I pass an equestrian center where Martin, our youngest, rode in Pony Club and started his career as an equestrian. It is here also, but not connected, in one rural landscape. We are Kansas, but like I said last week, I will never see it. But today's small children and young people will see and experience the changes. We will learn from other countries. We will make changes and expand our own ideas. It will take time. One of the issues I came across in my study of the small Dutch region I'm referring to is the fact of passing the farm on to the next generation. It's interesting to read of a grandfather sitting with his children around the table and after listening to the children say, "Let's do it. Go ahead." Many times the typical old farmhouse with attached barns had to be renovated or adapted for the new function. But the character of roofline and situation in the landscape would be retained. Some would add the experience of B&B and watching or partaking in the farm operation. We do that at times too. The ranching or farming experience in Kansas is shared. I think of the rancher who has people for pay. They pay help with his range burning. Some farms have added early morning bird walks. We can get up early and can be invited on a prairie chicken courting viewing. Again, it is the scale of things. Some farms run the old breeds of cows, easy to keep. At all times, the ambience of the region is brought forward and stressed. On one farm, the 2,000-year-old foundation of a Roman villa was located. They're thinking what to do with it. One farm has started producing earthworms on large scale for soil improvement projects. That farm used to be a pig farm. Of course, with the many regional trails and paths, horseback riding is part of the option. And then there is one farm which stands by itself. When I read the description, I thought, wow. It is the idea of a young couple with small children. Both have farm backgrounds, but neither farmed. They were able to buy a 25-acre farm with buildings. As they said, the move was a jump into the unknown. But they wanted the old farm to keep its sense of place. Part of the reclamation plan was restoration of the natural landscape and establish a space for saying goodbye to dear ones. The closest I can come is a funeral home in the middle of nature, with a beautiful landscape. Everything is directed towards peace and quiet. A flock of grazing sheep is part of the setting. It's called the Goodbye Homestead. It surely is different.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. Gus is featured every Wednesday right here. Well, glancing ahead to tomorrow's broadcast, we'll welcome in once more Greg Hanselcheck from the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory here at K-State. Greg will report on several cases that the laboratory is working right now of open beef cows that previously preg-checked positive. What may and may not be behind that, and Greg says the latter is especially important here. We'll cover that and much more on tomorrow's edition. In the meantime, if you've yet to do so, please look into our podcast page. That's agtoday.net. There you'll find out more about subscribing to the automatic download of each day's broadcast to your mobile device. Or if you'd rather, you can just listen to the podcast replay every day right there. It's at agtoday.net. Please take advantage of that. Until we're right back here tomorrow, then, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.